This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. With Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders railing against privilege in America, sociologist Isaac Martin reviews how the rich have organized themselves into a powerful lobby. Another sociologist, Caroline Lee, explains the concept of do-it-yourself democracy and how it might help with relations between police and civilians. And Bill Press talks with Assistant House Democratic Leader Jim Clyburn. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight, and follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Professor Isaac Martin has studied one particular economic trend in American history and tells us about that, and the topic of his book, The Rich People's Movements. And we say hello to Isaac Martin, professor of sociology at the University of California, San Diego, where he also teaches in the Urban Studies and Planning program. He's an expert on public policy and social protest and author of a book called Rich People's Movements, Grassroots Campaigns to Untax the 1%. Professor Isaac Martin, thank you for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. Social movements are usually associated with groups who are trying to grab a piece of the economic pie. What is the meaning of the title of your book, Rich People's Movements, which I should mention is now out in paperback?
Well, as you say, when we think of social movements, we usually picture movements of poor people. We might picture people protesting in the streets, picketing, petitioning, committing civil disobedience, and so on. And most of these tactics were actually invented by poor people who couldn't get a hearing any other way. But the big surprise of my research that I wrote about in my book, Rich People's Movements, is that sometimes in American history, people have used these same tactics to demand lower taxes on the rich. And that's the subject of the book, and the real puzzle here is why on earth anyone would do that.
You know, you make an interesting point that with poor people's movements, sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. But the surprising thing about rich people's movements is that they even bother. So why do they?
This is the surprising thing because, of course, most of the time rich people get their way pretty easily in American politics. But it turns out that sometimes they don't. And usually that's in response to a war or an economic crisis, and Congress needs to respond. And even members of Congress who might usually be pretty concerned about their wealthy constituents will decide, well, we need more revenue right now, and so we'll raise taxes on the richest 1% or what have you. And it's in response to policy changes like that many rich people feel really threatened, and often fear that that's the first step in a broader assault on their property rights. And many other people who aren't quite rich may agree with them or may share their fear. And it's in moments like that you find some people starting to organize rich people's movements.
In all this talk about the rich, does anyone agree on what constitutes being rich? Is it the top 1% we've been talking about for the last few years?
Well, this is such a funny question to ask people. You ask people about the rich, and everyone always thinks the rich is somebody, twice as rich as them, or something like that. So there isn't real agreement on what constitutes being rich, and there's certainly no official definition the way that we have an official definition of poverty. We have no official definition of being rich. I think the top 1% by income or the top 1% by wealth, either one of those are not exactly the same people, though there's a lot of overlap. Either one of those is a fine working definition. In the rich people's movements that we've seen in American history, often they're pursuing tax cuts for slightly broader groups than that, say the richest 3% or the richest 5% or what have you. And so these definitions change over time. What they have in common is these movements focus on getting some kind of economic benefit for the very richest people in American society, regardless of where exactly you draw that threshold.
Now, there is a widely held belief that the rich deserve their status because they have superior abilities and they work harder. Is there something to that? I do think that particularly in America today,
We know from the research of Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez that a lot of the rich today are what they call the working rich. They're people who get rich from salaries rather than from inherited wealth. So work is part of the story, but I think a lot of Americans who work hard at very low-paid jobs, know that that hard work is not the whole story. The truth is that luck, inheritance, and circumstance matter enormously for who ends up at the top of the heap. And if you try to do sort of statistical studies of who's going to end up rich and who's not, and you try to measure how hard people work, you're not going to find that explains very much of the difference.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Isaac Martin, professor of sociology at the University of California, San Diego, also the author of the book Rich People's Movements, Grassroots Campaigns to Untax the 1%. What is it that motivates the super wealthy to become politically active in preserving their position? Is it greed, fear, status seeking?
Usually it's fear. Greed. Greed. Although I think it's true that many very super wealthy people are perhaps especially money motivated. I don't think that explains why you would get politically involved, because there are a lot of easier ways to, if you're rich, to keep increasing your riches. But if you look at the history of this, it's always these movements that get lots of rich people involved in agitating for preserving their position. It's always in response to something they perceive as a threat from below, and whether that's the New Deal, or whether that's big income tax increases that were needed to pay for the Second World War, or whether it's fear of the Clinton health plan. But the fear that the position they have is threatened and that they might lose it in the future seems to be a very potent motivating force.
Well, you bring up something historically when you talk about the New Deal, but if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have had the boom that we had later on in years, right? I mean, so isn't there a reason for them to perhaps embrace some of these things? Wouldn't that perhaps actually increase their wealth or increase their status?
In the long run, it's certainly the New Deal was absolutely essential in the sort of laying the groundwork for the post-war economic boom and creating the kind of shared prosperity that American society enjoyed. Certainly a lot of very rich people benefited very greatly from that economic boom. So if you take the long view and you understand the interdependence of all of these macroeconomic forces, then I think it's quite clear that many of these rich people's movements are really self-defeating. But often they're motivated by very short-term thinking in a very very immediate and often quite unfounded kind of fear that really doesn't lead to that kind of long-term perspective.
Mm-hmm. Now, you document that the rich people's movements borrowed heavily from movements of workers, farmers, veterans. What are some of those tactics?
It's a fascinating story here. So some of the first rich people's movements, the so-called tax club movements of the 1920s, actually hired former organizers for the National Farmers Union. And you had hired organizers who were traveling the country, setting up dues-paying local chapters and engaging in exactly the kind of grassroots association building that we associate with populism and with the community organizing tradition in American history. Some later movements, there was a movement for income tax repeal in the 1950s and 1960s, and one of the tactics they used was actually, this is an explicit legacy of the veterans movement, was to do outreach through American Legion chapters and try to get American Legion chapters to sign on to repealing income taxes on the rich. One of the ones that's also maybe most surprising is the use of civil disobedience and tax strikes, withholding taxes from the government. There's some surprising history in the 50s where some feminists, supporters of the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1940s and 1950s, had learned the tactic of civil disobedience from their elders in the movement for women's suffrage. and decided that they were going to use that tactic. A handful of very rich women decided they were going to use that tactic also to push for repealing income taxes. And some other of these sort of rich activists who were declining to pay taxes probably had in mind the model of the industrial strike also, and knew about strikes from their own industries, and thought, well, we could do that too. So there are a lot of sources for these tactics that are quite surprising. But in every case, we see people basically learning and borrowing tactics from populist movements and movements of the left.
Did the rich people's movement start with opposition to the federal income tax?
Yes. I mean, I think that the federal income tax, and in particular the ratification of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which permitted a permanent federal income tax in 1913, really set the stage for the rich people's movements to come. Although it wasn't until after the First World War, when there was a big increase in federal income taxes to pay for the war, that rich people's movements first really started to get organized and mobilized. But this does seem to begin in American history with the federal income tax, and it seems to respond to changes in the federal income tax.
Okay. Isaac Martin, professor of sociology at the University of California, San Diego, author of the book Rich People's Movements, Grassroots Campaigns to Untax the 1%, now available in paperback. Professor Isaac Martin, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It was a real pleasure.
And it was a pleasure having you with us. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Professor Caroline Lee says her concept of do-it-yourself democracy, or public engagement, is a new trend that brings experts from all walks of life together to work toward shared goals. We'll talk to her about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Like some vaudeville shtick, Barack Obama keeps blathering that a huge flaw in his global trade scam doesn't exist. But then, the flaw hits him in the face like a big cream pie. The president's trade scam is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it's a corporate boondoggle loaded with gotchas that hurt workers, consumers, our environment, and others. But its most damnable flaw is that it would allow foreign corporations to sue the U.S. in corporate-run tribunals to make us change or even repeal any of our laws that might pinch their profits. No, no, shouts Obama, there is no chance, zero chance of that happening. But splat, splat, reality has smacked him in the face with 2 cream pies. Using an earlier trade scam, the World Trade Organization has ruled not once but twice this year that 2 U.S. laws must be repealed or modified to satisfy the profit goals of corporations in Mexico and Canada. On May 12, a WTO trade tribunal ruled that our dolphin-safe tuna labeling law, which lets you and me know that the tuna we buy has not been fished with nets that trap and kill dolphins, violates the free trade right of Mexican tuna fleets to use the cheaper dolphin slaughtering nets. And 2 weeks later, another WTO tribunal hurled a second cream pie. This one smacks cool, an American consumer law that requires country of origin labeling on meat products, so your family and mine can know where the meat we buy comes from. Our Congress passed this sensible right-to-know law. Our courts have upheld it. 92% of Americans support it, but a group of corporate lawyers on a WTO tribunal has overruled us. This is Jim Hightower saying, now Obama wants his TPP to create more corporate kangaroo courts. To tell him, don't TPP on me, go to tradewatch.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Sociologist Caroline Lee thinks that the idea of public engagement, or do-it-yourself democracy, can bring people together to transform basic relationships, such as between police and the community. And we say hello to Caroline Lee, Associate Professor of Sociology at Lafayette College and author of the new book, Do-It-Yourself Democracy, The Rise of the Public Engagement Industry. Caroline Lee, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks, Jim.
Hey, we'll start off with the question, what is public engagement, and what do you mean by the public engagement industry?
Okay, so this is a vague term, and nobody really knows when I say it off the bat what it is. If we're talking about participation, that has a long history in the U.S. So you could think about like New England town hall meetings or the civil rights movement, or even things like quality circles or maximum feasible participation, and a lot of different touchstones of those past practices sort of show up in these current practices. But what I'm calling public engagement is this still developing field that's come about in the last 30 years or so. And so this is an industry that includes independent consultants and internal staff in organizations and even volunteers who are producing and facilitating events. And these events are focused on engaging a broad cross-section of people. And I say that as opposed to something like grassroots lobbying that listeners may have heard of, where, for instance, corporations are trying to mobilize a targeted group of people like smokers for a smokers' rights group. So here in public engagement, we're really looking for a broad cross-section of people, and public engagement professionals are trying to engage those people more deeply in any kind of decision that affects their lives. So these are experts, since it's a new field, these are experts that are coming to engagement from a lot of different backgrounds, and that might be anything from community organizing to corporate consulting.
So is that what this is, community organizing?
It's not community organizing, and the funny thing here is that community organizing actually has a little more in common with something like grassroots lobbying, right? In as much as community organizing is mobilizing a targeted group, such as residents in a neighborhood, and here in public engagement, we're typically looking at a much more broad cross-section of all relevant stakeholders.
Okay. Now, probably the most famous community organizer, President Obama, came into office promising to be the most transparent chief executive in history. In your eyes, how has that worked out?
Okay, so it's a funny question because actually probably the better model here is Michelle Obama, who was a community engagement officer at a hospital in Chicago, which is exactly the type of folks I'm talking about. So as far as Obama, on his first day in office, he signed an open government directive, which told federal agencies that they needed to get participatory, collaborative, and transparent starting on day one. And my book actually argues that these trends in governments reaching out in more substantive ways are bipartisan, and they began a long time before Obama came into office. So Obama's was sort of, he had this famously participatory campaign, and he rolled out the open government directive right away. But really, if we look at in the 90s, Bill Clinton's administration, he was experimenting with dialogues on race. And George W. Bush's administration had agencies like the CDC and collaborative environmental decision-making within the EPA. So he actually had plenty of agencies that were doing a lot of this sort of more substantive public engagement than just what was officially mandated.
We're speaking with Caroline Lee, Associate Professor of Sociology at Lafayette College and author of a new book, Do-It-Yourself Democracy, The Rise of the Public Engagement Industry. So Caroline, when a federal agency opens its rulemaking for public comment, do those comments ever actually matter, or is it only the comments written by lobbyists?
Okay, so it's really important to realize that this type of public engagement that I'm talking about is an alternative to those standard legal formats for public participation. Okay. So there's a lot of groups that are actually really good, including lobbyists, but there's lots of groups that are actually good at participating in federal rulemaking. And what I'm talking about with public engagement is something that looks like an alternative to that. It's much more accessible. It's much more oriented towards a cross-section of everyone instead of interest groups that have very clear stakes in those kinds of issues. But it's also important to realize that a lot of this new public engagement still takes place alongside mandated public hearings, those sort of 5 minutes at a microphone or 2 minutes at a microphone, really unsatisfying forms of official public participation. And all of those kinds of traditional forms where people who are good at that kind of participation can continue to get what they need through those processes. So let's talk a little bit more about what these public engagement events are. These are the industry produces events for clients from every sector. So that's national governments, but also local and state governments, corporations, community organizations, and nonprofits. And most of these consultants don't specialize in a particular type of client. What they're doing is trying to get diverse people talking meaningfully with each other. So really an emphasis here is not on one-way information sharing or consultation, but a two-way dialogue among stakeholders and with the sponsor. And when I say sponsor, sometimes organizations like governments or corporations are going to be paying for these processes, but sometimes there will be a third-party funder, and those might be like community foundations or development organizations or universities or corporate philanthropies. Those groups are often interested in subsidizing public participation.
Well, that leads me. That was going to lead me into my next question. Were those who are putting together public dialogues? Aren't they really doing it for some commercial or political agenda? Otherwise, who would have decided to do it?
Yeah, so there are lots of different reasons to do a public engagement process. And what I'm arguing here is that, if we just look at the sort of diversity of events, you could have a series of discussions in community centers and public schools on police-community relations, or you might have like a statewide project combining online forums and in-person dialogues on healthcare policy, or like a congregation, a religious organization holding a visioning process, or national social media initiative to sort of encourage dialogues on mental health. All of those look really different, and some people would argue that they don't really even have a lot in common. And what I'm arguing is that what a lot of these events have in common, and the reason why this sort of deeper public engagement is used, is typically when the sponsors and the organizers anticipate pushback from the public. Okay, so this is a strategy that takes some effort. You usually have to hire consultants to do it. So they're not going to do it unless they're anticipating some kind of public blowback, or when contention is likely, when it's already occurred, when people are already fighting. They'll tend to use one of these processes. And so it's important to realize that at the same time that the sponsors may have, some kind of agenda like, hey, we just want to get this decision made, public engagement professionals are really serious about avoiding having these processes seen as public relations, right? So the development of public engagement has been framed in opposition to PR. So if public engagement is seen as window dressing, then it's not really valuable to the organizations, right? A lot of times people say, well, that process was fake public participation, but this is real public participation. And public engagement consultants really believe that they're not responsible to the client or to the public, but to the process itself. So they want to make sure that ground rules are followed and that the process isn't manipulated by any group. And that includes the sponsors, but that also means, organized segments of the public.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Caroline Lee, Associate Professor of Sociology at Lafayette College, author of Do-It-Yourself Democracy, The Rise of the Public Engagement Industry. So, Caroline, is public engagement or dialogue and deliberation, is that more likely to succeed in large institutions like corporations or school systems, or more so at, say, the village meeting level?
Okay, so it's important to think here about how these public engagement professionals are going to define success. So the theory here is that good public engagement processes should help people discover shared values, build civic and grassroots capacity within the community to achieve better decisions. So by practicing deliberating, they should get better at doing it on other issues. That they should result in better group performance, right? So if you do this within a corporation, that they're going to see higher profits and things like that. And ultimately, that public engagement processes will just lead to more public engagement. So if some people are dissatisfied, participants are dissatisfied, but they think that the process was fair, then that's okay. So that's what success means here.
Okay.
And, that kind of success can happen at any scale. I mean, your question sort of addressed scale. And the community scale is a lot easier to handle logistically than, for instance, trying to get a national level dialogue going.
And that would make sense.
So that makes sense. So generally, we do see these happening. You will see some really large-scale, ambitious, national-level processes, but the local level, community level, tends to be more common. One side note is that corporations can often afford much better funded, more customized processes than, for instance, a low-income community.
So they both succeed, but they do it. They both succeed, but they do it different ways.
Yeah, I mean, certainly depends on what people are aiming for. But if you're looking for a high quality process, usually corporations are able to achieve something that looks like that more effectively, just because they've got more money to spend on a longer time period. They're sort of more committed to making this really be an authentic process.
Sure.
What I'm arguing scale-wise is that there's been this sort of subtle shift in how we define the success of civic action in these processes. So these processes focus on discussion, and they've really shifted the scale at which people think it's reasonable to make change. So participants who engage in these processes, they tend to feel better about civic life, but they also tend to see the local level as really the only reasonable place for them to engage in action. Like action, it's focused on what are the actions that you can take right away to make change in your community. And that's great, but it leaves out a lot of other actions like lobbying for regulation and things like that. The sort of larger politics of public life get left up to those institutional sponsors. And my argument is that the U.S. faces such challenging systemic problems that even though action at the local level is nice, we can't really afford for the ambitions of the electorate to be defined down to just the local level.
Well, is this movement then needed because representative government and the electoral system has failed us?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. So, a number of trends in the 90s drove demand for public engagement. There was a sense that civic participation of ordinary folks was declining, and that these participation processes that were formal were just dominated by usual suspects and interest group professionals. So, today's model of collaborative, deep participation is really contrasted with that 2 minutes at a microphone format that everyone from The Onion to Parks and Recreation have made fun of, right? And that model just clearly wasn't working.
Yeah.
And the new public engagement focuses on reasoned discussion among equals, and people being able to change their mind or find common ground by actually listening to each other's viewpoints. So it's pretty easy to see why this idea of this alternative to people screaming at each other appeals to just your average citizens, but also to political scientists and administrators or managers.
How can public engagement inform the difficult relationship between police and the communities they serve?
Yeah, that's a great question, and this actually is used a lot in cases of police-community relations. So it's a useful strategy for transforming relationships. So especially on this issue where there's already a lot of discontent and contention, as in these recent protests around police shootings of unarmed black men, these dialogues are going to focus on shared values like safety and to get people to see each other in the round, not just as officers or angry activists, but as people who share the same community.
Okay. Caroline Lee, Associate Professor of Sociology at Lafayette College, and the author of a new book, Do-It-Yourself Democracy, The Rise of the Public Engagement Industry. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Assistant House Democratic Leader Jim Clyburn.
One of our best friends of the program here, fighting the good fight on behalf of all progressive Democrats in the United States House of Representatives every day. From South Carolina, Peter's home state.
Yes, indeed.
The Honorable James Clyburn. Hello, Mr. Congressman. It's good to talk to you again.
Well, thank you so much for having me. How are you this morning?
Everything is good. Everything is good. And so are you guys now officially on break, Congressman?
After votes today, I think the break starts. For some strange reason, the Speaker on yesterday informed us that he's going to bring things to a screeching halt after business today. But Democrats are going to stay around here for a while. He'll have a press conference in the morning to take a look at what we left undone, including fixing the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court has asked us to update. But for some strange reason, the Republicans are refusing to do what the Supreme Court asked us to do.
Well, meanwhile, Congressman, there are several states that are moving to really restrict voting rights. Notably, your neighboring state of North Carolina, but that's not the only one.
No, my home state of South Carolina
also
sort of led on that. In fact, we came out with some pretty draconian new laws even before the Supreme Court issued its decision. At least North Carolina waited until that decision came. My home state anticipated the decision as if something had been telegraphed and came up with some new laws to restrict and suppress voter participation and turnout.
What is it? What do they say is behind this, Congressman? I mean, our most fundamental basic right in this country as Americans, right, is the right to vote, and not enough people exercise it enough. But still, one would think that our energy should be toward encouraging more people to vote and making it easier for more people to vote.
Well, Bill, I think what happened here is that the Republicans do a very good job of assessing where the mood of the country is, where their constituents, how those constituents are thinking. And what they have done is tap into this natural suspicion that exists about government and about public officials. And they have conjured up this notion of massive voter fraud taking place in the country.
Which is just not true, right?
It's absolutely not true. But, you know, I come from a state that has been worshiping the Confederate battle flag for decades, since the 1960s. You and I know the Confederate battle flag went on top of the South Carolina State House dome back in 1962. Yet they say that's their heritage that they have been celebrating since the Civil War. Well, it's not their heritage, but they have played into these kinds of notions, and they get a certain amount of acceptance for this chicanery by highlighting things that definitely is not true, but they touch at certain emotions that people have. And so that's what has happened here. There are people who think that Barack Obama is an illegitimate president, that he got elected because of something untoward taking place at the voting booths. So that's what has happened here. And people are saying, well, I remember a couple of pretty popular TV hosts saying voter ID is necessary. Well, I used to live 2 or 3 doors from my poll manager. Saw him every day. We grew up fraternity brothers. But every time I walked to the polling booth, I presented him with my ID. So it's not about IDing voters, they have put under this umbrella of voter ID, getting rid of Sunday voting, getting rid of early voting.
Right.
So what does ID have to do with when you vote? ID is to determine who is voting. So there's never been any question about who has been voting. The question is about how they have been voting. And so we don't want them to vote because they aren't voting for us.
That's what it boils down to, I think. Now, would your legislation, Congressman, would it take precedence over the state attempts to suppress the vote? I mean, would there be some national standards then?
Absolutely. It would go back to what it's been since 1965. We are going to be celebrating. Next week I'll be in Minneapolis, Minnesota, helping the National Black Journalists celebrate their annual meeting, which will be on the 50th anniversary, August 6th, of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And we will be calling attention to the fact that this formula that was put in place back in 1965 to get rid of this kind of chicanery, things like what we call poll taxes and other forms of discrimination against voters. We want to say to states, you cannot just change a voting place without adequately informing people. You cannot just deny voter rights to people because you don't like the results that come out of the elections. And so this focus on these minority precincts that is taking place in the last several months. Look at what they did up in Ohio, where they collapsed 3 and 4 voting places into one to create long lines to discourage people from voting. This kind of stuff we go after with these amendments, and I don't know why that is something that my Republican friends would not like to see done.
Well, it's not the only item left undone, right, with Congress fleeing town. I'm thinking of the Highway Trust Fund bill.
The Highway Trust Fund expires at the end of this month. It looks like we're going to do another for the 35th time short-term patch. How can states and localities plan big highway projects when the funding is 3 and 4 months at a time? They can't do it. The XM Bank that makes our businesses competitive with other foreign countries, that is coming to an end, and we're leaving without dealing with that. So there are a lot of things that will terminate the end of this month and next that we won't be here to deal with when the end comes.
On the, we're talking again to Congressman James Clyburn from South Carolina, representing the 6th District of South Carolina. How about the Iran deal, Congressman? When will that come up for a vote? Let me ask you first of all. You've had a chance, I'm sure, to review it so far. Are you a vote for the Iran deal?
I will absolutely vote for it. I don't see any legitimate alternative to this except maybe a war. And the country is tired of war. Let's give diplomacy a chance. This whole notion is that this is good for 15 years, and after 15 years, what? Well, if you've got 15 years to practice getting along with each other, who knows? It may break out and be a good thing. When I hear people talk about us not being able to get along with the Iranians, how much trade are we doing with China? I remember as a kid growing up, before Nixon went there, China was a place that we did not want to have anything to do with. How much trading are we doing with Russia?
Vietnam.
Vietnam.
Yeah.
I mean, these are it's just crazy. If we believe so strongly in democracy, then let's give democracy a chance to take root in some of these other countries. And who knows, they may like it, they may fall in love with it, and we may all live happily ever after.
And you think President Obama will end up getting the votes for the Iran deal?
Yes, I do. And he won't get a majority vote, but under the deal, if he doesn't like what Congress does, he can veto it, and then it'll be up to Congress to override or sustain the veto. I predict that the votes are there to sustain his veto.
And I know before you leave town, the president has invited all of you down to the White House this afternoon for a little reception in the East Room. I'm sure you'll be going down there and hear all the stories about his African trip, which seems to be have been a great success, Congressman.
It was a tremendous success, and I regret not being able to go. My wife has been having some health challenges, and I decided not to leave the country. But about 20 of my colleagues, maybe 25, counting the Senate, went on the trip. And I have talked twice by telephone with them as they were leaving Kenya, and then again last evening as they were leaving Ethiopia. It seems to have been a tremendous success, and I applaud the president for, I think, adding to his legacy in this big way. Leaving, I think, one big thing that I would hope that all of us will tackle in a bipartisan way, and that's some real judicial reform that has to take place in this country.
Right. That's another item that's still undone, but the president's making a lot of headway on that, and I know he's even got some Republican support for that. So there's a lot going on. Well, Congressman, enjoy your time, and thank you for fighting the good fight, and thanks especially for joining us this morning.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
All right.
Very good.
There he is, Congressman James Clyburn from South Carolina. Peter, you're on stage. By the way, that's a big vote for President Obama.
Huge vote.
To have Honorable James Clyburn. I haven't heard that he's announced before that he's going to support the deal, but he carries a lot of weight. A lot of people follow his lead in the House. Good for him.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Isaac Martin, Caroline Lee, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host,